Thanks everybody for coming to the first speaker of 2018's Minds, Technology, and Society seminar. We thank the Glushko and Samuelson Foundations and the School of Social Sciences, Humanities, and Arts for funding. Today our speaker is Karthik Panchanathan, who is from the Department of Anthropology at the University of Missouri. Karthik got his undergrad and Ph.D. at UCLA, was briefly teaching at Pomona College before going to the University of Missouri. He works on a wide variety of topics related to evolution, human behavior, and culture. And today he'll be talking about the evolution of sensitive periods in development. So, welcome.
Thanks for inviting me. Can you guys hear me in the back? Good? Okay. So as Paul said, I'm going to talk about the evolution of sensitive periods in development. There is some technical material here. I'll try my best to explain it, but if something doesn't make sense, feel free to raise your hand and ask a question. When in doubt, ask the question. I'll decide whether I want to answer it now or later, but don't hold back in asking the question. So I want to start out with an observation that's obvious. A part of what goes on during development is specialization, and this ranges from quite cognitively and simple organisms, including these little planktonic crustaceans, these Daphnia that come, you notice they come in these two different, this isn't boy, girl, and boy and girl form. These are two different adult morphs. They have the potential to become either one, and early on in development they kind of make a decision, as it were, to become one type or the other. This one with a helmet gives them quite a bit of protection against predators, but it comes at the cost of their ability to swim. So this morph swims better, but that trades off against predator defense, and so you'd think that and the key to understanding why they come in two types is that not all environments are the same in terms of predator richness. And in this particular case, I think they get two doses of information, one from mom before they're even born. She passes along chemical information from the water, which provides information about the relative abundance of predators. And then after they're born, they have another dose period in which they sense the environment. And they use that, obviously it's too late once the predator's shown up, so they have to make this decision under uncertainty as to whether to develop the predator-safe or not morph. All the way at the other end, us and humans, this is data on foraging production and consumption among Thiache, a group of hunter-gatherers in the Amazon, males and females. On the y-axis is the calories that they are producing or consuming per day. On the x-axis is their age. Blue is the production lines, and red are the consumption lines. A couple of things to note, just as sort of as an aside. You'll notice that if I were to show you a picture like this of any other mammal, including primates, the red and the blue line, except for the period in which mom gives their babies milk, the red and the blue line match. If the red and the blue line don't match, they die. Humans are the exception in the primate world, in which there's a lot of calorie transfers across age and sex lines. In this particular community, and fairly indicative of hunter-gatherers in general, men from roughly the age of 20, let's say 30 to 50, are massively overproducing in terms of the calories compared to consumption. They're net consumers early and late in life. Women, because of the extra demand of pregnancy and lactation, are net producers until they become grandmothers, and then during the grandmother phase, they're producing more than they are consuming. That's not what I'm really interested in today. What I'm interested in today, you notice the shape of that production curve. So what do you think makes a good hunter? Why are some guys better hunters than others? Practice, and? Sharp stick. They don't use sharp sticks, they use bows and arrows and other things. So part of it is physicality and part of it is experience and skill. If it was just physicality, you'd think that the 20-year-olds would be the best. They're not. They're actually barely making it. The best are Actually, in some ways, the production curve for a hunter-gatherer looks a lot like the production curve for an academic, where you spend a bunch of time learning, and then you sort of have this period of 10 to 20 years where you're influential, and then sort of cognitive decline sets in. And in the case of the foragers, it's physical decline that sets in. But that curve, that strongly kind of S-shaped curve, it takes a very long time to learn the skills. And similarly, a Daphnia here with a helmet, that was this big would be better than this one, but the bigger that helmet, the better the predator defense. So the key point is, in many developmental domains, it's not just whether you have a trait or not, it's how well you've developed that trait, how long you've spent developing that trait that matters. And this is captured nicely in Anthropology, at least by Clifford Geertz, who described humans as this way. One of the most significant facts about us may finally be that we all begin with the natural equipment to live 1,000 kinds of life, but end in the end having lived only one. So there's this idea of lots of potential, latent potential there, and it's a product, some developmental process or set of processes that determine which sort of life outcome one has. And so before I get to the modeling work that addresses those kinds of questions, I want to start with some very basic stuff on nature and nurture to sort of set the stage for the kind of questions that I'm interested in. Often, this is a very common thing that undergraduates ask when I teach, and sadly I think it's a kind of thing that comes up a lot in academics too. Is it nature or is it nurture? And, and sometimes nurture is seen as good and nature is seen as bad, but the point is they're sort of in contrast, and I want to sort of disabuse you of this idea of nature versus nurture and show you why that's a bad way of thinking about how development works. And to get there, I want to talk about these little soapberry bugs. Have you guys seen these before? Anybody not seen these? These are soapberry bugs, they're little seed eaters, and we're going to focus on two different populations, one in Oklahoma and one in Florida. And one of the interesting behaviors here, they're mated, and the males have these specially evolved genital hooks that they use. When they find a female, they will hook onto the female. The act of insemination is very fast, but they will hold on for quite a bit longer. And it's variable how long they hold on for. And so my question to you is, what determines, what kinds of factors influence whether a male holds on or doesn't hold on? It's called mate guarding. And one possible explanation, which we're not going to get into because we don't know much about their psychology, maybe they're sort of hugging and holding, we're not getting into that. What other kinds of factors? Why do you think they hold on? Why hold on at all?
If there's more males in the area?
If there's more males, why would it be advantageous to hold on if there's more males in the area?
Then nobody else can mate with her.
Right, so the longer he holds on, the longer his sperm have a chance to fertilize all of the eggs inside of her. If he lets go right away, there's a possibility that another male comes along and inseminates her as well, limiting his reproductive success. What's the flip argument? Why let go?
You made another woman?
There's other females out there. And so one ecological variable that might matter is the local sex ratio. If there's a relative abundance of males to females, you should see more mate guarding. If there's a relative abundance to females to males, you should see less mate guarding. That's at least the prediction. And if we go to Oklahoma, we observe that pattern that local sex ratios vary patch to patch, and the males seem to be adjusting their mate guarding based on that. There's still an open question as to how are they figuring out this optimal mate guarding level. It could be the case that there are different strains, and in some patches they're just genetically evolved to hold on for a certain amount, or it could be that they're somehow developmentally learning this. What we can do is we can bring them into the lab. So you bring a whole bunch of males into the lab, breed these males, take siblings, and rear them in different environments, and observe, are they adjusting, are they not, and that's what you see. Here we're adjusting the sex ratio, 2 males to every female, 1 male to every female, 2 females, and the relative amount of mate guarding more and less. And in Oklahoma, raised under laboratory conditions, you see this, what we might call phenotypic plasticity or adaptive plasticity. So if we saw that, we would conclude on our earlier nature versus nurture. We'd say, aha, mate guarding is due to nurture, right? The environment seems to matter. Now the interesting thing, you go to Florida, I forget exactly why. I think it's that populations are bigger, so there's less variation patch to patch in terms of sex ratios. There's no variation in sex ratios, and so when you go out there, you observe fixed levels of sex ratios, but again, you don't know what their capacity is, so you bring them into the lab, same conditions, and you observe this, that all the males, irrespective of their developmental conditions, will mate guard the same. So if you'd not studied Oklahoma and you'd only studied Florida, you'd say it's nurture, it's nature. It's their genes or something like that. And if you only observed Oklahoma, you'd say it's nurture. The point is that it's nature and nurture. The way I think it's useful to think about it is the environment is playing a proximate role in shaping development, at least in Oklahoma, and it's natural selection that's playing this ultimate role in shaping what the developmental mechanisms are. In Oklahoma, selection is favoring developmental mechanisms that allow for phenotypic plasticity. In Florida, selection is canalized development such that there is no scope for phenotypic plasticity because any variation would just be a mistake. Pick the right number and stick with it. So in that way, you can think of natural selection playing this ultimate role and development or the environment playing a proximate role. So it's not nature or nurture, it is what kind of developmental system has natural selection favored? And is it a system that allows for plasticity or not? Does that make sense? Okay, so with that, we can move forward. Coming back to the issue of expertise and development, there is not a lot of research, at least in evolutionary biology, and if you work in psychology, I'm happy to hear about it. There's not a lot of work in evolutionary biology on the evolution of developmental systems in which you have this kind of specialization or expertise effect. So my colleague Willem Frankenhaus and I were interested in trying to develop a framework, a mathematical framework that allows us to study natural selection that shapes development that has several features. One in which development is contingent, where the experiences kind of affect what happens next. It's dynamic, in which the current options that you have in part depend upon the outcomes of previous stages of development. So you can't treat each day as independent, but the days are sequential, or the months or years, whatever it is. And incremental, meaning the more time you spend developing a trait, the more expertise you have in that. And the tool we use is a tool called stochastic dynamic programming, which is an optimization technique very common in computer science, economics, to some degree in biology, that's well suited to study problems like this. To give you a flavor of how that works, we'll start out with an experiment. Suppose we all catch a flight to Chicago, and we get dropped off right here, and we want to end up somewhere on the Page Museum at the end of the day. And we only have enough time to sort of walk through, we can't double back. And we've got to figure out, you can sort of use this technique to figure out the optimal path through the city. And I'm gonna sort of model this in this very artificial abstract way in which we've got sort of intersections, and then we can either go in one direction or the other. We want to end up there, or we start there. And I'm just completely making up these numbers to show you how this technique works. If we start out here and we go down this road, that's worth 7 points to us, whatever points mean. This is worth 4 points to us. 6, 7, 3, 3. Make sense? So how would you figure out the optimal path through? Anybody?
Could you brute force search?
You could brute force search. You could start at the beginning and map every single pathway through. You could do that, and as the space got bigger, that becomes harder and harder and harder. So chess is a game that has a finite number of games that could be played, but if you brute force search from the beginning, you'd never finish. At least you'd hit the heat death of the universe before you found an answer to that game. There are other ways of doing it, and one way of doing it in some games, not in chess, but in other games, is you can start at the end and work backwards. And I'll show you how that works. That's the technique we use here. So we start at the very end, and if I were to end up here and I go down this way, it's worth 8 points. If I go this way, it's worth 5. I don't make any decisions, I just record that. And now I peel, and so all else equal, I'd rather take that path than that path. That's all I know at this point. I record that. Then I go back one level. And now if I were here, this is worth 9 plus 8, that's worth 17. If I were here, and the number on the left, I think, is the path going right. So 9 plus 8 is worth 17, 5, 5 is worth 10, 8, 5 is worth 13. So what I can record now is, if this is all I knew, I don't really care. Either of those are fine, this is suboptimal. But notice I've eliminated this, and I've eliminated this one path. I know that if I end up over here, I know I can prune that path away. And then I can peel it back another level. And through this iterated process of backwards induction, I can record the optimal path through that tree, and also all the suboptimal paths. If for whatever reason I meant to get there, but the bus dropped me off there, I've recorded the best path forward. So it's preserved in case of any screw-ups. I've still got paths through, and the blue shows you the optimal. And you keep stepping back through this, and in this particular case, it looks like this is the best way of going until we get to the very last one, and then in this particular case, it flips. And so I end my dynamic programming with this. This is called an optimal policy. So this gives me every single intersection. It gives me a set of instructions of what I should do. And if I screw up and get sent over there, I've recorded the pathway through. Does that make sense? So this approach to stochastic dynamic programming results in what are called optimal policies, pathways through these large trees. Using this, in this particular case, we use this method of backwards induction. So we use this to think about how to build a model of development. It's very artificial and bad in lots of ways, and I'm happy to argue about why it's bad. I don't think it's a great one, but it lets us do what we want. And here's the first model that I want to present, showing you this trade-off. And the way that biologists, evolutionary biologists, usually think about plasticity or development is in terms of what are the relative trade-offs that are being negotiated, and how do we optimize given those trade-offs. So here we've got a situation in which our ecology is in one of two states. In the case of the Daphnia, it's either safe or dangerous. There are either predators there or there aren't. We've discretized it. You can think of it as wet or dry. It doesn't matter. We can make this as many states as we want. The point is there are a set of different states. I'm going to present two because it's easier. And for each state of the environment, there is a corresponding phenotype that is optimal. Individuals have a prior belief about the ecological state that they're in. This is a Bayesian prior, but we're not saying that the organism itself sort of consciously understands this. Instead, if the species has been subject to recurrent selection pressures in which some fraction of them experience one environment and the other fraction experience another environment, that distribution of environments that were experienced over evolutionary history will be represented in some way as a prior distribution of environmental states. Does that make sense? In each time period, the organism has a choice. It can sample a cue, telling it which environment it's in, or it can specialize towards one of two targets. So it's forced to choose. One way of motivating this is to think about the dilemma that every undergraduate faces, or at least I faced. You've got a finite set of time. You've got 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, however many it takes you to finish your undergraduate, and you've got to figure out what major you want to do. And you can think of sampling in this particular case as taking a GE, which tells you something about your aptitudes and interests. And if you spend all 4 years taking GEs, you will figure out exactly what you're good at and what you like, but you will be terrible at it. Or you can take it the other route and pick a major in day one, and you'll have a lot of time to become an expert, but it might be a terrible decision that you've made. So there's this trade-off between how much time do I spend exploring to try to figure out what I want to do versus how much time do I want to exploit that. That's the trade-off we have in this model. That doesn't matter right now, that'll come up later. And so that's the trade-off, right? The trade-off is between earlier specialization gives you a higher probability of making a mistake. The later you specialize, the less expert you can become. And so that's, in that particular case, how should selection balance this exploration-exploitation trade-off? One other thing I want to add, and I don't think I need to say this in a group like this, although maybe for some grad students, there are many advantages to trying to turn your hypotheses and theories into computational or mathematical models. One of which is you are forced to think very carefully about every single assumption you make. Often you didn't even know you needed to make assumptions. And in one case that got us thinking quite hard about it is, well, how does expertise translate into fitness? And that's not a trivial question. You could imagine in some domains, the more time you spend specializing, you have diminishing returns on that. In other cases, it's somewhat like a linear relationship. In some cases, it'll be an increasing relationship. You could also have more complicated ones, but this covers a wide range. Anybody, any graduate students or faculty trying to learn R? Yeah, so one of the problems with learning something like R is that it kind of looks like this. You seem to invest month after month after month, and nothing happens. And you just start hating yourself and hating the person who told you to learn it. But I promise you that if you keep investing, then suddenly gains happen quite a bit. And then you'll hit plateaus at other stages in which you got to break through. But something like Excel, if you meet somebody, and let's imagine this is years you've spent mastering Excel, you've pretty much captured everything with it. You meet somebody who's like, 20 years I've been learning Excel, they're squeezing barely nothing out of it. Versus others, so that's just a way of thinking about in different developmental domains, the mapping between fitness or utility or score and time invested can be different. So it allows us to explore different kinds of, and that actually seems to matter. And if you didn't sort of do the modeling, you wouldn't necessarily know whether that kind of assumption matters or not. And so in this talk, I don't really have time to get into the real details of it. I want to show you some of the flavor of the results. So one thing we can do with this is now we've got this model, we can look at what kinds of individuals emerge. And so here is a way that we try to represent this. I'll walk you through this very slow, step by step. Here we've got diminishing, linear, and increasing returns. Here we're varying how reliable the information is in the environment. Over here, reliability is slightly better than a coin flip. Basically, you don't learn much with each learning trial. Over here, they're 95% accurate. You need one trial and you know exactly what's going on. So we can vary those two parameters. In this particular case, one environment, world one, so the world is either in state 1 or 0. In this particular case, world 1 happens 3 times more likely than world 0 over evolutionary history. So what we're showing you here is each one of these triangles. In our case, there's 20 time steps that the individual has. And if they spent their entire 20 time steps learning, they'd end up as a dot, being represented as a dot up there. If they spent 20 time periods not learning at all, but specializing to 0, they'd end up there. 20 time steps, 1, they'd end up there. So this is a way of showing, this is a barycentric coordinate system in which you've got 3 numbers that add up to a constant. This is a way of sort of showing that. Somebody in the middle would be a third, a third, a third. So what you see, a couple of things to notice. So when returns are diminishing and information is terrible, you've got everybody ending up right there, which is halfway between both extremes. What you've got there is no, selection is favored, no learning whatsoever. Instead, individuals sort of bet hedge. They just become a generalist who's good at both, and they just ignore the information that they've got. That's the best they can do in that environment. Down here, same information strain, but we've moved to increasing returns, and now you got nobody in the middle. Now they become these gamblers. Early on, they just flip a coin. They ignore the information, they just flip a coin and choose. I'm gonna be a physicist or I'm gonna be an English major. I don't really care what kind of grades I get. Because the key in this kind of world is to be an expert. Knowing full well that half of them are gonna be wrong. They're gonna get burned really badly. You maximize learning, and so as you inch up on these vertexes, you get more learning. So you get more learning, 1, as you move from increasing to diminishing returns, and 2, as you're sort of intermediate in terms of information quality. That's the sort of take-home message from that question.
Yeah.
And these are measuring mature adults, mature simulated agents.
I'm confused about what the 1s and the 0s are, and like.
So this is a case in which, so this vertex here, so the world is in one of 2 states, 1 or 0. So a dot down here is an individual who spent all 20 time periods specializing towards World 1. Specialist towards World 0, sort of a career graduate student up there. Does that make sense?
Well, I'm curious, like, so is it symmetric, like, in one trial, like, say that bottom center one, the 0.75 key reliability, increasing returns, is it symmetric? Like, why did they choose 1 versus 0?
So they're getting information, and the information is, so in 0.75, so what we do is we use the dynamic programming to come up with an optimal policy, and then we simulate actual environments, and then stick those policies in those simulations, and this is 10,000 individuals simulated. This is the aggregate results. So in this particular case, all the individuals actually, good question, all the individuals actually grew up in this world. But because of their evolutionary prior, they start before learning, they think I'm three quarters likely to be here, I'm 1/4 likely to be there. That's what they think starting. And then they start sampling a bit. And in this particular case, here they almost all get it right because information is very good. Over here, information is intermediate. So that's why and in this particular role with increasing returns, selection favors a strategy that samples once and then specializes. So 3/4 of them will get this Q and be right. 1/4 of them will get that Q and be wrong. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes more sense, yeah.
What's the fitness of an individual that doesn't specialize?
Who ends up there? They get no points.
Okay.
So that's the trade-off, right? So if they spend their whole life learning, then they'll get 0 points. So there's strong pressure for them at some point to quit, if that makes sense, right? You don't. And so here's what. So if this shows you this shows you what these mature phenotypes look like. But there's another way in which you can kind of look at. If you could look, in some sense, there's a way of taking a developmental mechanism for phenotypic plasticity and translating it kind of like into a recipe, a set of instructions. If you wanted to see what that set of instructions look like, this is our attempt at graphically representing it. So again, this is developmental time on the x-axis. Here is its Bayesian posterior on the y-axis. So first of all, that's wrong. I should change that. They all start out with a 50-50 likelihood. They don't start out with, that's incorrect. That should be 0.5. So they all start out not sure, maximally uncertain about whether they're in this world or this world. And the color corresponds to what they do. So black says, so in this particular case, this set of instructions says, in time period 1, sample. That's black. And some individuals move in that direction, some individuals move in that in terms of their information, and then thereafter specialize. So these guys sample once and run with it. These individuals here are the bet hedgers. I labeled them purple because they want to end up 10-10. These individuals here are coin flippers. They don't sample at all. Half of them end up specializing in one direction, half of them go in the other direction. Here, with intermediate Q reliabilities, especially with diminishing returns, you've got this kind of rich learning psychology where they spend early in their life kind of sampling, and for stochastic reasons, some will go in one direction, some will go in the other, and they're basically waiting until they hit a sort of critical posterior, and then they just sit with it and run off. The other thing you notice that's kind of interesting, which is not surprising in retrospect, but if I took a time slice up and down, these guys are all genetically, in some sense, the same. They're all executing the exact same program, but because information is stochastic, at some stage of development, some of them have gotten very bad information, very mixed information, so their sensitive period is still open. This guy here, anybody there. But the same individual who received consistent information for stochastic reasons, he shuts his window and just sticks with it. So you get differential sensitivity at the same age because of variation in environment.
So 2 quick clarifying questions.
Sure.
Is there negative fitness? So if you are in the wrong state entirely, so if you commit to a state and it's wrong?
Next model.
Next model, my bad. And then the other question, is there a cost to adaptation? So what is it? certainly there's the cost of specializing such that you won't go back to another world, but is there also a cost of like energy expenditure?
Very good question. So in the literature on the evolution of plasticity, in our particular case, the only costs are opportunity costs. That's the only cost here. There are classes of models, like Davidson-Wilson has a couple, in which you've got constitutive costs. The actual machinery of learning. So, you know, in order to power a developmental system like that, as opposed to a developmental system like that, there's more instructions there than there. And in this particular case, there's no penalty, there's no cost associated with it. We were just interested in how, assuming away all of that cost, what will the trade-offs give you? But those are other kinds of things to think about, is the actual machinery that powers the plasticity should have costs as well. Good question. Anybody else? Okay. I'm going to skip that. Except to say that in some weird way, what this is showing you here is the prior probability. Here, half the time you're in one world, half the time in the other. Over here, most of the time you're in one world. Here's information quality. And you do get these kind of weird, non-linear. In this particular case, this is an elevation map. So this is the fraction of the life that across a whole bunch of individuals they spend learning. So over here in this corner, where the world is most likely going to be in one state rather than the other, and information is very good, there's very little learning that's going on. And as you move in this direction in terms of the prior, and in this direction in terms of Q validity, you sort of climb this hill where you get maximal learning over in this corner. And then the other thing is, in this particular case, you end up with a topography that looks kind of like Half Dome, where you get this sort of hill climbing on this side, but then you get this enormous cliff that just falls off entirely. So this entire region down here, once information crosses a threshold below, it doesn't matter what else is going on. There's no learning that's going on in that model. Okay, so that's one. Coming to your question, that trade-off that we had between taking GE classes and specializing, or whatever it is, that's an extreme. That's at one extreme in terms of assumption space. Here we've got the same kind of model. The ecology is in 1 of 2 states, and there's a corresponding phenotype for each. When should I go until? 10 minutes?
We have the room until 5.
5. Okay, I'll probably talk for another 10 minutes. 15?
As long as you want.
Okay, all right. Well, not as long as I want. Individuals have a prior belief, again, just like before, based on their evolutionary history. And now, instead of actively acquiring information, they passively get it for free. So every time step, they just get information about the state of the environment. So the information is free, as opposed to in the last one, it's very costly. And now they can choose to specialize in 1 of 2 directions, just like before, or they can choose to delay specialization entirely. And the reason they might choose to delay is there's cost to making mistakes. You don't want to, because in the previous model, you would be going in one direction and then realize, oh, I better go in this direction. Whereas here, you're penalized for switching. And the idea there is you might have to resorb the tissue or retrain those circuits, whatever it is. There's some cost to going back to an undifferentiated state before you can go back in a different direction. You could all, in the previous model, we kind of assumed these dimensions were orthogonal, whereas now they're in some sense opposite to each other. So there's still a trade-off, but it's a different kind of trade-off. Before it was a trade-off between exploring and exploiting. Now there's a trade-off between now there's this cost that they've got to worry about. So they've still got this trade-off between specializing. The earlier they commit, the more expert they can become, but the more likely they are to pay this cost of making a mistake. And this actually, we got interested in this one really over the issue of sensitive periods. I'll show you how we studied that. But first, coming back to these mature phenotypes, I'm showing you a bigger space because it's more complicated. Here, world 0 is, world 1 is 10 times less likely than world 0. Over here, it's the other way around. Here they're 50-50, so that's the prior along this dimension. Q validity is varying from poor to strong. And what you can see now is you have lots of individuals in the middle. And the middle means when they're in the middle, they're mixing the different types, and you've got a lot more going up. They're weighting a bit. and what's going on, and then the corresponding kind of equivalent of a developmental set of instructions become much prettier and so more complicated. The greens are really weird things that are doing a whole bunch of different individuals end up doing different things, so we just colored them green. I'm not so interested in that. What I want to show you with this one is it allowed us to study sensitivity in the following way. Don't look at this for a second. I'll walk you through what this is. We used the dynamic programming approach to come up with the optimal policy, so what development looks like. Now we've got this developmental program, and then what we do is we follow individuals through development. So I take an individual and I clone him 21 times. So I've got 21 individuals. And then I put them all in a household in one environment. And in time period 1, I take one of those 21 sibs and move him to the opposite environment. And then I take a step forward in time, and I've got 20 left. I take one of the 20 and send him over there. Take another step forward, take one. And so in each time period, I adopt out one of the sibs. And then I revisit them at the end of development. And I look at all, so one of them stayed in the same household. The other 20 all got adopted out. And the question is, the one who stayed in the same household, are his adopted out sibs like him or not, as a function of when they got adopted out? And that gives us a way of studying sensitivity. If they end up the same way he did, even though at some point they move to the opposite kind of environment, that tells you that the sensitive period is closed. If they're polar opposite in personality or whatever dimension, then that tells you there was still a lot of sensitivity there. So that's, and then we did this 10,000 times, simulated this 10,000 times, and that's what these dots measure here. So here is the age at which the adoption happened, right away at birth, all the way right before, at the age of 20, whatever this artificial 20 means. And then we measured the kind of Euclidean distance in this two-dimensional space between the focal individual and the sibling. And that's measured on this dimension. We take the average of 10,000 replicates. So the bigger that distance, the more divergent these two individuals are. No difference, it means they're the same. So you can see sort of here where most likely they're going to be born into one world and Q reliability is terrible. These guys are not paying attention to information. And so it doesn't matter when you adopt them out, they didn't do any learning anyways, they all end up the same. In other cases, it's sort of smooth, but in some cases, you get these very steep drop-offs. That's sort of what's interesting to us, where for a certain fraction of their lifetime, they're very sensitive, and then it just sort of bottoms out to 0. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Okay, so I'll just wrap up, and then I'm happy to chat about this stuff. This is our sort of first attempts. There's a lot of simplicity there, but these are the kind of key driving thing, interest is we want models that, for a long time, development and evolution have been separated. Since the modern synthesis, development was the one branch of biology that was kind of left out of evolutionary biology. That's starting to change. Lots of people are working on these kinds of issues. And in our particular case, we think of development as this adaptive process and evolution as this adaptive process. And when they're both working together, which they should be, as we saw with the soapberry bugs, it's natural selection that's building these developmental mechanisms, there becomes this division of labor. What kinds of problems should be solved adaptively through genetic evolution, and what kinds of problems should be solved through developmental dynamics? But in order to study that kind of a question, you need a model with generation to generation developmental dynamics embedded within evolutionary dynamics. You can't study them in isolation if you want to understand how they work together. This is one way of studying that kind of process, and it allows us to study in one particular way sensitivity, in which we treat sensitivity as the outcome of the adaptive process. So in our model, when you see these sensitive periods, those are adaptive. They're not byproducts. They are by design based on the environment, but there's a lot of artificiality there. So in our case, in some developmental domains, you think of them as relatively open. So the kinds of languages we can learn are infinite. The kinds of development that we're modeling here are finite. In our particular case, there's 2 kinds, but we could have that. But the point is, there's a finite set. So at some point at birth, in some sense at birth, all the possible phenotypes that they could end up are already programmed in. So we can study sensitivity in these kinds of closed developmental systems that are artificial in some ways, of course real in some domains, but not applicable to others. One thing we want to do, and we sort of sketched out a paper with Andrew Bartow, who's a computer scientist who works on reinforcement learning. The technique that I talked about here is stochastic dynamic programming, which is, one way of thinking about it is it's offline planning. So when I walked you through that Chicago model, none of us are going to be able to do that ourselves. This is something we can build a computer program that can solve it. You ask a human to sort of backwardly prune a large tree and they'll fail miserably at it. So there's always been a challenge. There's always been a challenge in evolutionary biology to the use of dynamic programming as a model of how animals would behave, because natural selection is a forward-moving process. Stochastic dynamic programming is a backwards-inducing one. I'm okay with that because there is some mathematical work showing that if given enough time, selection will hit on the same answer that dynamic programming. So I'm okay hiding behind that. But what it doesn't allow us to do in our model, the organisms don't do any meaningful learning. They just look up answers. Selection has given them a book, and they just look up the answers. What reinforcement learning allows us to do is we build reinforcement learning agents, vary in their complexity, and we stick them on these kinds of tasks that we have, and we allow them to evolve. And then the question is, how will natural selection prune those reinforcement learning strategies? Will they become more complex, less complex? Sometimes it'll prune it all the way back to fixed strategies. Other times it'll ramp up so by putting reinforcement learning in, we now actually have a better way of studying these kind of open problems rather than closed ones. I have nothing to show on that other than a paper that sketches what that might look like. So with that, I will stop after 45 minutes and take questions.